The day my boyfriend called me too small for his world, I realized I had just learned everything I needed to know about the man I thought I loved. But the truth is, he didn't know who I really was, and that was the whole point. I still remember the exact moment the idea first crossed my mind, the quiet kind of thought that slips in gently, like a draft under the door. It was a Tuesday evening. Rain tapped softly against the windows of my apartment, and the smell of garlic and butter filled the kitchen while I stirred pasta on the stove. My phone buzzed on the counter, lighting up with Ethan's name. "Hey, baby," he said when I answered, his voice smooth and warm like always. "What are you doing tonight?" "Just cooking," I said. "Nothing exciting." "Cooking again?" He laughed lightly. "You're like someone's little housewife already." At the time, I laughed with him. Now, looking back, I realize how often he liked putting me in that small box. But back then, Ethan Lawson was the man I thought I might marry someday. We had met almost a year earlier at a coffee shop downtown. I was sitting by the window with my laptop, reviewing reports for the company I helped run. Ethan was in line behind me, and when the barista accidentally spilled his drink, I offered him my table while they remade it. He smiled like it was the best thing anyone had done for him all week. That smile had a way of pulling people in. Tall, broad-shouldered, with carefully styled dark hair and the kind of confidence that made strangers listen when he spoke. He introduced himself like we were already halfway through a conversation. "I'm Ethan," he said, sitting across from me. "Claire," I replied. What I didn't tell him was that the company whose financial reports I was studying belonged to me. Or at least, partly. My father had built a logistics company from nothing before he passed away 6 years earlier. When he died, the business transferred to me and my older sister. While she handled international operations, I quietly oversaw the domestic side. It wasn't flashy work, but it was ours. And because my father had raised us carefully, with discipline and humility, I had never been someone who flaunted money. I drove a modest car. I lived in a comfortable but simple apartment. I wore practical clothes most days. Not because I had to, but because I preferred peace over attention. So when Ethan asked what I did for work that day in the coffee shop, I simply told him the truth, just not the whole truth. I work in operations for a logistics company. He nodded, impressed enough. "Sounds serious," I said with a small smile, and that was how our story began. At first, Ethan seemed like everything a woman hopes for. He was attentive, charming, the kind of man who remembered little things, how I liked my tea, the books I mentioned wanting to read, the way I always tucked my hair behind my ear when I was nervous. He brought flowers sometimes, texted good morning every day, called just to hear my voice. For months, I believed I had found someone genuine. But little things, small things, started to collect like dust in the corners of a room. And once you see the dust, you can't unsee it. It began with comments, not cruel ones, just revealing ones. One night at dinner, he asked casually, "So what kind of salary does someone in operations make?" I shrugged, enough to live comfortably. He leaned back in his chair, studying me. "You ever think about doing something bigger? You're smart. You shouldn't stay stuck in a middle-class life forever." The words didn't sting at first. They puzzled me. "I'm actually pretty happy," I said. He smiled like someone humoring a child. "Well, happiness is easier when you haven't seen what real success looks like." I brushed it off. Everyone has different views about money, I told myself. But the comments continued. When we passed expensive cars, he admired them loudly. When he talked about the future, he always described a life filled with luxury, penthouse views, exclusive clubs, designer, everything. "I'm not meant to live small," he once said, staring out across the city skyline. "I know I'm meant for something big." And then he glanced at me. "Don't you want that too?" At the time, I simply said maybe. But inside, a quiet question began forming. Did Ethan love me, or did he love the idea of a life he thought I could help him reach? The first real crack in the illusion appeared 3 months later. It happened during dinner with his friends. They were loud, confident men, the kind who talked about money the way athletes talk about scores. At one point, one of them asked Ethan, "So, what does your girl do again?" Ethan chuckled. "She works some operations job, nothing glamorous." The table laughed. "Future housewife material," another friend joked. Ethan didn't correct him. He just smiled, and something inside me shifted quietly. That night, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, a strange thought settled into my mind. If Ethan believed I was just a modest, middle-class woman, then maybe that belief would reveal who he really was. So I made a decision. I would stop correcting his assumptions. In fact, I would lean into them. I would let Ethan believe I had far less than I did. Because sometimes the only way to understand someone's heart is to remove everything they think they can gain from you. And that, well, that was how my little test began. At the time, I thought it would last a few weeks, maybe a month. I had no idea it would lead to one of the most painful and revealing moments of my life. Because when people believe you are powerless, they stop hiding who they really are. And Ethan, well, Ethan stopped hiding very quickly. Looking back now, I realized that pretending to be poor didn't require much effort at all. In fact, my life already looked simple from the outside. My apartment was modest but warm, a small two-bedroom space on the third floor of an older brick building. The wooden floors creaked slightly when you walked across them, and the windows overlooked a row of maple trees that turned deep orange every fall. It wasn't luxurious, but it was peaceful. My father used to say something that stayed with me long after he passed away. Money should make life quieter, not louder. So I never chased the kind of life that demanded attention. I liked grocery shopping on Sunday mornings when the aisles were calm. I liked cooking dinner instead of ordering expensive meals. I liked walking through the park with a coffee in my hand and no schedule pulling me somewhere else. Ethan, on the other hand, moved through life like someone always trying to be seen. Even the way he entered a room carried a kind of performance. His voice got a little louder around certain people, his laugh stretched a little longer than necessary. His stories about work often included exaggerated pauses, the kind meant to impress. At first, I thought it was just confidence, but slowly I began to notice something else beneath it, a hunger.
Ethan worked in real estate. Not as a major developer or investor, but as a junior agent in a firm that sold mid-range properties. It wasn't the bad job. In fact, he did fairly well for himself. But to Ethan, fairly well was never enough. One evening, about a week after I decided to continue my little test, he came over to my apartment carrying takeout boxes. "You still cooking every night?" he asked as he stepped inside. "Most nights," I said. "Well, tonight you're not," he grinned, placing the bags on the table. "I brought sushi." The smell of soy sauce and sesame filled the room as we unpacked the containers. We ate on the couch, watching some forgettable reality show. For a while, everything felt normal, comfortable. Then, somewhere between the second and third roll of sushi, Ethan leaned back and looked around my apartment. "You've lived here a while, haven't you?" 3 years, I said. He nodded slowly. "You ever think about upgrading?" I raised an eyebrow. "Upgrading?" "Yeah," he said casually. "Something nicer. A high-rise, maybe. Better neighborhood. Concierge building." I smiled faintly. "This place works for me." He studied me for a moment like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "You're very content," he said finally. "Is that a bad thing?" He shrugged. "Not bad, just unusual." That word sat quietly between us. Unusual. I didn't argue. Instead, I simply asked, "What would you do if you had a lot of money?" His face lit up instantly. "Oh man, where do I start?" And just like that, Ethan launched into a detailed vision of the life he imagined for himself. Luxury penthouse, private gym, weekend flights to Miami, a sleek black sports car, designer suits. He described it all with the kind of enthusiasm people usually reserve for childhood dreams. I listened quietly. When he finished, he smiled and said, "What about you?" I thought for a moment. "I'd probably buy a small house near the water," I said, "somewhere peaceful, maybe open a scholarship fund in my father's name." Ethan blinked. "That's it?" I laughed softly. "That's a lot already." He shook his head, smiling like he couldn't quite understand me. "You're too simple, Claire." The words weren't meant to be cruel, but they carried something deeper, a quiet judgment.
Over the next few weeks, those small moments continued piling up. Ethan loved expensive places, restaurants where the lighting was dim and the menus didn't list prices. But whenever the bill came, something interesting happened. He always hesitated. Sometimes he paid. Other times he casually slid the receipt toward me. "You don't mind splitting, right?" he'd say. And I never did. But I noticed, because the places he chose were never the kind I would have suggested. One night after dinner, as we walked past a jewelry store glowing under bright white lights, Ethan stopped and stared at a diamond necklace in the window. "Someday," he said quietly. I followed his gaze. It was beautiful, delicate, sparkling under the display lights. "You like jewelry?" I asked. He smirked. "I like what jewelry represents." "And what's that?" "Status," he said simply. That word stayed with me the whole drive home. Status. Not beauty, not sentiment. Status. Still, none of it felt serious enough to confront. People can be materialistic without being cruel. At least, that's what I told myself. But then came the night of his office party, and that was when the first real clue appeared. The event was held at a rooftop bar downtown, the kind of place where the city lights stretch endlessly below you like scattered stars. I wore a simple navy dress and low heels, nothing flashy, nothing designer, just something comfortable. Ethan arrived to pick me up, wearing a fitted gray suit and the confident smile he always carried to social events. "You look nice," he said, giving me a quick kiss. "Nice?" I teased. "Not stunning?" He laughed. "Let's say understated." I smiled politely, but as we drove toward the city center, I noticed something. Ethan kept glancing at my outfit, not admiring it, evaluating it. When we arrived at the rooftop bar, the place was buzzing with laughter and clinking glasses. People in sleek dresses and sharp suits moved between high tables under soft golden lights. Ethan introduced me to his coworkers, one by one. "This is Claire." "What do you do, Claire?" "I work in operations." Polite nods followed. Then someone asked a question that changed the entire tone of the night. "Operations where?" I mentioned the company name, carefully, without emphasizing my role. One of the men tilted his head. "Isn't that a pretty big logistics firm?" "Medium-sized," I said lightly. Ethan laughed. "Trust me, she's not running the place." Everyone chuckled, and I laughed too, but something about the way he said it, the way he rushed to minimize me, stayed with me. Later that evening, while Ethan was at the bar ordering drinks, I stood near the railing overlooking the city. Two of his coworkers were talking nearby. They didn't realize I could hear them. One of them said quietly, "She seems sweet." The other replied, "Yeah, but Ethan's not the type to settle down with someone who's not bringing serious money to the table." They both laughed, and in that moment, the quiet little test I had started suddenly felt a lot more serious, because for the first time, I began to wonder something I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. Was Ethan with me because he cared about me, or because he believed I might eventually become something useful to his ambitions? And if that was true, how long would he stay once he realized he thought I had nothing to offer? I didn't know the answer yet, but very soon I was going to find out.